Yes, I'll try to pick up where Florian has left and introduce two additional matters into the discussion of European integration and refugee crisis. Namely, I will try to make a comparative analysis of countries that are placed in the Western Balkans refugee route, and to see whether the phase of their integration into the EU makes any difference with regard to the outcomes in response to the migrant crisis. And secondly, I will try to establish a pattern of perhaps wasted opportunities or unwanted consequences if we talk about the economy and if we talk about a socio-demographic situation in the Western Balkans. But before I start, I would like to maybe just to recap a bit something that we all know, and but it's coming useful in regard to my research design. So of course, we all know that the refugee wave to Europe in 2015 came via Eastern Mediterranean, and refugees came overseas to Greece, and then they either walked or bicycled to North Macedonia, to Serbia, and then forward to Hungary, from where it was relatively easy to reach their points of destination in Germany, Austria, and elsewhere in the Western Europe. But if we look at the geography, then wouldn't it make more sense to just go through Bulgaria and to avoid the risks of taking those small inflatable boats and travel by sea? Well, of course, it would be, but we need to remind ourselves that in 2014, Bulgaria was the first country to partially build the wall / barbed wire towards Turkey, thus making the passage via land to Western Europe practically inaccessible to the migrants. And this was not the only country, of course, that did so. Already next year, in September 2015, Hungary first threatened and then established as well barbed wire, first bordering on its border towards Serbia, and as immediately migrants found another route which would go through Croatia, then Hungary obviously built a fence towards Croatia, thus fencing off two EU member states. And this obviously sparked the chain of events, so that afterwards we have seen similar barbed wires on Croatian border, on Slovenian border, on Austrian border, and also we have seen the introduction of temporary, I would again use these quotations, temporary border controls within the EU itself, thus abolishing values of freedom of movement, etc. So here I would maybe draw the first conclusion that apparently, regardless of the fact in which stage of EU integration the countries find themselves, their answer was pretty much similar, and it was very much inward-looking, self-protectionist. And if we look at the cases, if we first of all define the Western Balkans as incorporating these countries that found themselves on the route, so North Macedonia, Serbia, Croatia, and Slovenia, we see that we have a relatively older EU member states, the newest EU member state, Croatia. We have a negotiating candidate country, Serbia, and then we have a candidate country for EU membership in North Macedonia. And regardless of the stage of their accession, we do not see much of a difference in their response to the crisis. And also, what can be said as a joint conclusion is that basically none of these countries felt any sort of responsibility for the cause of the migration itself, and also they did not try to find the ability to, they did not attempt to solve the crisis, but simply to serve as a transit route towards the Western Europe. So it can be said that the response of these countries, or in these countries, encompassed, first of all, lack of European solution, mutual accusation between the neighbors, at the same time pleads for solidarity, anti-immigrant rhetorics, barbed wires, sinister images, appeal for upholding European values, and also recalling tragedies from the not so distant 1990s wars that were fought in the region of the Western Balkans. So all of these elements created sort of a cacophony of voices and sent mixed messages not only to the incoming migrants but also to the local population and to the EU as well. And in this regard, we can see that the challenges of transition, because the Western Balkans is still undergoing democratic transition, economic transition, in some instances even institution building. So the challenges of transition that were then coupled with the refugee crisis actually led, first of all, to detachment of these countries, because basically the first answer was, this is not our problem. And secondly, as the crisis evolved and wouldn't stop, frustration and even panic of the government, because basically they understood that the help or the answer, the unequivocal answer from the EU is missing, and therefore they would need to come up with the answer for themselves. And to understand their answer, Florian has already mentioned the framework of securitization, but perhaps to understand what this framework means, I would borrow on the previous scholarship on it to declare that an issue becomes an object of security concern if it is presented as an existential threat to a referent object. So basically, if you portray migrants as terrorists or as criminals, this is how you introduce the securitization element into the migrant issues and migrant affairs. So basically, once the securitization element has been introduced, it led to the justification of the use of extraordinary measures to handle these migratory flow. And one of the consequences that Florian has already touched upon is the imminent decrease of democracy in such circumstances. So basically, it is securitization of migration has led to the decrease of democracy and to the more of a military and policing into the affair of of resolving the Western Balkan migratory route. So basically, if we now focus on the answer, not only on the answer but the outcomes, we've seen that two kind of fears have been triggered in the Western Balkan countries that do not necessarily recall and echo fears that were created in the Western Europe from the migrant crisis. The first one was the fear that the influx of refugees might spark up fire and could trigger new conflicts in the region that has only recently ended up with their own conflicts. And the second one resonated fears in other parts of Europe, and that would be that the crisis would import insecurity. And if we can say, of course, the crisis is not over, but the main influx has drastically decreased, then we might say that basically we see this the answer for the upcoming crisis would definitely be shifted towards a more security-driven view of migration, and the countries of the region seem to be prepared for more forceful measures to be taken if the possible flow would increase again. But at the same time, what about these opportunities that I've mentioned? We have seen that, of course, the crisis did not lead to the reconciliation among the countries of the region, but it did intensify the levels of cooperation between the governments, and especially between these sectors of security politics, so military, police, border controls, etc. So this was one of the positive effects of the very unfortunate crisis that has loomed over the region. And what has been the answer of the EU? Well, as you have heard, the EU was first of all void of its own common asylum policy, and therefore it either ignored or tacitly approved the measures, including tightening of borders, etc., that are still being used in the region. And obviously, we might also debate about the impact of some EU member states' politics towards the migrant crisis. So Hungary, most notably. The first answer of the Western Balkan countries towards the politics of Viktor Orban was mostly critical. But as the crisis has evolved, we've seen more of a spirit of Orbanism in the region as well. And we have seen that many aspects of politics that has been taken, first of all, introduced by Hungary, has also been revived in the Western Balkans, but not to the full extent. So, for example, only Croatia has managed to introduce, through legal act, criminalization of solidarity towards migrants, but it has failed to impose this law. So, yes, this spirit of urbanism has definitely been introduced into the local politics, but not to the full extent. And part of the reason is precisely that these countries are still transit countries and not the countries of destination for the migrants. And this also explains why the economy-related concerns have barely deflected the debate from the Western Europe in the Western Balkans. But if at all, so the context of whether refugees and migrants would take over our jobs was not present in the discourse in the Western Balkans. But what it did come to the surface was the negative demography in the region, because it is obvious that if the trend continues in the Western Balkans, then we have this narrative of the Balkans becoming passive lands with elderly people who are actually very bitter about their present, anxious about the future, and at the same time nostalgic about the past. And the debate in the Balkan was mainly opened up about the possibilities to import workforce from neighboring countries, and particularly the broader context of broader consequences of such act, namely how would that change the culture or national homogeneity of the Western Balkan countries. So what policies could be done basically to keep young people, young professionals from the Western Balkans not to immigrate themselves to the Western Europe. So this is pretty much the debate that was shaped by the migrant crisis. But of course, it is not a new story. It was simply perhaps accentuated because of the migrant pressure. So to conclude, it is obvious that the conflict, that political instability, poverty, and climate change will continue to uproot people, and obviously the crisis is not over, and therefore with regard to the Western Balkans, it can be concluded that Western Balkan countries will continue to be mostly a transit region, and the policy of no responsibility or ability to resolve the crisis would probably continue to function as it is. But the argument that due to the fact that Western Balkan countries are poor economies does not actually give too much solace to the fact that migrants would not prefer to stay there. And at the same time, second, with regard to this membership to the European Union, it can be concluded that it was not a decisive factor in response to the crisis, because we've seen that along the route, all the countries manifested pretty much the same kind of answer towards the crisis, which was inward-looking, self-catering, and security-driven approach to the migrant crisis. So if anything can be concluded, then it is the fact that the answer, both of the countries of the region, but also of the EU, was pretty much reactive towards the events that were happening and that triggered the influx of migrants and refugees. In fact, the answer should be more proactive. And if we talk about the common response or the common approach to the crisis, these are the elements, so the root causes that need to be tackled. So the conflict, political instability, poverty, and climate change. So the Western Balkan region should find its a place in these pretty much global discussions and try to impact the root causes of the problem rather than to be reactive and did not show the, as I said, reliability or ability to react. Thank you very much.